Hi guys, this is our screencast on the age of absolutism and the absolute monarchs in Europe. Excuse me, from 1500 to 1800. It's one of the last topics we have this year. There's just one more assignment after this on the Enlightenment. It's quite a long chapter, quite a long slideshow, so I'm going to try to go fast and kind of just point out the most important things about absolutism and the specific monarchs that you need to know. So, an absolute monarch is a king or queen with absolute control over their country and their people. Absolute monarchs believe that they got their absolute power to rule from God in a theory known as divine right. The idea that God created the monarchy and that the monarch only answered to God, not to his people or her people. And this is very similar to the mandate of heaven, which we saw in China. Okay, as Europe emerged from the Middle Ages, monarchs grew increasingly more powerful because they were able to centralize their power. And basically what that means is that they had to have everyone in their nation recognize them as the sole ruler. You can say you're the ruler, but if people aren't following your direction, if no one is recognizing you as the ruler, you're not the ruler. So the nobles that were in the most power and the highest rankings after feudalism in Western Europe they would develop their own armies, build up their own armies, and battle each other. And whoever won those series of battles became the new king and brought that power of everyone in the nation under their control. So that's what we mean by centralizing power. Several factors help them centralize their power. Again, feudalism is gone. There is no local ruler to be loyal to. Instead, we see the formation of nations as those little kingdoms across Western Europe disappear, and the boundaries expand again into countries like Spain and England and France being some of the first of those. The growth of nations meant people wanted kings to defend them, right? Not their local feudal lord. And kings were responsible for building up armies. And those armies are going to protect the nation and the people. Feudal kingdoms had turned into nations. I said that already. Also, after the Protestant Reformation, the power of the church is going to go down. If you remember, the power of the church replaced the centralized government under the Roman Empire when that fell. And now that the church has lost its power, it's going to be replaced by several different monarchs in the Western European countries. Absolute monarchs make the laws without the consent of their people. The people do not have a say. They did not question the king's authority. The monarchs controlled the military in order to expand their territory. They use their army to expand the land that they control. The more land you control, the more power you have over the people on those lands. Okay, a piece of literature here that, advocated for absolute rulers. It was written by Thomas Hobbes, and the title of the book is The Leviathan. A Leviathan is a sea monster. And this book was published in 1651. The main ideas in this book, justifying absolute rule, are that without government to keep order, there would be constant war between people. So a government is necessary. People need to hand over their rights to a strong ruler in exchange for law and order. So you can't do anything that you want because that will infringe on other people's rights. And if there is no government in place, you're going to have a chaotic situation like we had under feudalism in the Middle Ages. So this agreement between people and their government, Thomas Hobbes called a social contract. The people agreed to give up some of their rights, or in some cases all of their rights, in exchange for a government that will protect them. And Thomas Hobbes said, finally, a ruler needs absolute power to keep his or her citizens under control. Okay, and now for the absolute monarchs that you need to know. Excuse me. The first is King Philip II of Spain. He was the great grandson to Ferdinand and Isabella, who had all the land in the Americas claimed for them by Christopher Columbus and the other Spanish conquistadors. And so they had a lot of money, and he inherited those colonies from his father and became very wealthy from them. He used the money from the colonies to support an army of 50,000 soldiers. And remember, Spain is a very strongly Catholic country. Philip II was Catholic, and he saw it as his responsibility to defend Catholicism from the spread of Protestantism after the Protestant Reformation. Philip also married Mary the first from England, who was the daughter of Henry VIII, and his first wife, the one that he divorced, Catherine of Aragon. And he was married to her for a while, giving him also some power over England and Ireland. Okay, second absolute ruler, and this guy is the face of absolutism. It's Louis the 14th from France. He became king when he was 14 years old. He is famous for his quote, "I am the state," is the English translation. You can see here in the picture that he was very much into fashion. If you look at the way he's standing, he's got that one leg forward. The French kings especially like to show off their calves, that part of their leg. And so he wore high heels to show off his calves, and he wore tight stockings to show off his calves. And there's a couple other pictures coming up where you'll see that, that he kind of stands that way to show off his legs. All right, Louis XIV is also known as the Sun King. He believed that, like the sun, all power radiated from him. He believed that he was the center of all of France and even all of Europe. He, excuse me, I need a drink. So, to centralize his power, he had to be recognized by all of the other nobles in France. And so if you've ever heard that phrase, keep your enemies close, but your enemies closer, he actually brought the nobles to live with him in his castle at the Palace of Versailles, which he had built 10 miles from the capital city of Paris. He also created this group of intendants, or his officials, who went out throughout France, collected taxes from the people, reported anything to him that they saw as suspicious going on amongst the nobles, so that Louis could be prepared if any of the nobles tried to take his power away and overthrow him. Okay, here's a picture, a painting of the Palace of Versailles. It had beautiful gardens, fountains, tons of gold decorating the inside. Okay, here's the gate to the palace. Obviously, a picture taken more recently. Some pictures of the gardens, the courtyard. More fountains and gardens. This was his bedroom. Oh, and this is the famous Hall of Mirrors. The famous Hall of Mirrors, it was an addition to the palace. It was built so that the light coming in from the one side would reflect on the wall of mirrors, and you can see it's decorated in glass and gold and crystal. Actually, the famous Treaty of Versailles ending World War I was signed in this Hall of Mirrors. Another glimpse of the Hall of Mirrors. Okay, finishing up on Louis here, he made France the most powerful country in Europe. They were considered the military leader, the strongest country militarily while he was king. His strong military allowed France to develop an empire of colonies. So, when we talked about the age of exploration and the different European countries claiming land in the Americas, Louis claimed land in the Americas. New France was his colony, and it was named after him, right? The Louisiana Territory, right? Named after King Louis of France. However, he waged a lot of war in Europe with his powerful army. And, war is great when you're winning, but it's not so great when you start losing. And so these wars that he fought in Europe, whether he won or lost, put France in a lot of debt. And in order to pay off this debt to other countries, he raised taxes on the poor. And over several generations that came after him, the French rulers taxed the poor more and more, to the point that they cut off Louis XVI's head in the guillotine, and that was part of the French Revolution, which you're going to talk about next year. A couple more pictures of Louis. Again, you can see in those red tights, he's trying to show off his calf muscles. Okay, this was considered high French fashion. He did wear a wig. That big black hair was a wig. Okay, moving on to our absolute rulers of Russia. The first is Ivan the Terrible. What you need to know about him is he was the first Russian leader to take the title of Tsar. Okay, Tsar is Russian for Caesar. And by using that title, he was trying to show Russia's connection to the old Roman Empire and its glory. Okay. So again, like Louis, Ivan had to fight a battle, for power against his nobles. In Russia, the nobles are called the boyars, Russia's landowning nobles. And he did that with a lot of force. Okay. His life is sort of broken down into a good period when he was happy and kind and nice, and a bad period after his wife died, when things went downhill. So during the good period, he won great victories. He added territory to Russia, starting to make it one of the largest countries, that is still one of the largest in the world today. He gave Russia a code of laws that were actually quite fair. But then his wife died, and he went into a depression and entered the bad period in his life, in which he organized his own secret police known as the Streltsy, who would hunt people down. He became very paranoid that the nobles, the boyars, were trying to overthrow him, and anyone that he suspected of being a traitor, he would have killed by his secret Streltsy police. They dressed in all black, rode all black horses. Very intimidating. Okay, his police took away the land of the boyars and gave it to a new class of nobles who remained loyal to him, or they would lose their land. Okay, in a fit of rage, he killed his oldest son, who was considered the most capable heir to the Russian throne. And in doing that, he only had his second son left, who was physically and mentally ill, left to take over ruling Russia. This picture here is St. Basil's Basilica. And that is one of the things that he had built, one of the buildings that he had built that is still there. It's known for its architecture. So that one good thing left behind by Ivan the Terrible. It's a Russian Orthodox church. All right, next absolute ruler from Russia is Peter the Great. He is distantly related to Ivan by several generations. He is known as Peter the Great because he was one of Russia's great reformers. He continued to the trend of increasing the Tsar's power. So when Peter became Tsar of Russia, Russia was very much behind the rest of Europe. Europe had gone through the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Scientific Revolution, and Russia had not experienced any of that. And so Peter made it his mission to not only catch Russia up to the rest of Europe, but to surpass what Western Europe had done in terms of moving ahead. Okay, so some of the key words that you need to know about Peter the Great are westernize and modernize Russia. Okay, and by westernize, we mean he wanted to make Russia like Western Europe. And in order to do this, he was the first czar to ever leave Russia, and he went on what he called a grand tour of Western Europe, studying all of the shipbuilding and all of the technology that had been developed in Europe that Russia had not yet learned about. And when he returned to when he returned to Russia from Western Europe, he he implemented everything that he saw in Russia, built up an army of 2,000 men, had them actually trained by Western European military officers, changed their uniforms. They all had to wear a more Western European style uniform. Typically, the Russian military and the Russian nobles wore the big, long, heavy wool coats, because of the weather in Russia being so cold. And he changed everything to be more Western European like, in terms of his army, in terms of their dress, in terms of their training. Okay. One thing that Peter realized that Russia needed was a warm water port. There's a lot of W's with Peter the Great, right? Westernize and warm water port. Russia, like I said, is very cold. They have a large amount of coastline, but most of that, if not all of that coastline, remains frozen for the entire year. And so it was hard for Russia to trade along its coast because you couldn't get the ships in and out with the frozen ports. And so he made it another goal of his to establish a warm water port for Russia so that they could trade with the Western European countries. This port, I believe I have a map coming up in a second. I'll show you where it was along the Baltic Sea. And so he had to fight a war with Sweden to take over that land from him. He built up a huge navy. He helped to build his own navy with his own hands. And he used that navy to fight a war against Sweden and gain Russia some land on water that does not freeze. On that land, he had a new city built in his name, the city of St. Petersburg, Russia, and it became, here comes some more W's for you, Russia's window to the West. Okay, so westernize Russia, establish a warm water port for Russia on the Baltic Sea, and build a city which would be Russia's window to the West. And of course, he had that city named for him, St. Petersburg. Okay, yes. So this is the Baltic Sea. All right, you can see St. Petersburg. I don't know if you guys see my arrow that I move, my mouse that I'm moving here, but St. Petersburg is the big red dot. You can see it's right on this small section of coastline that Peter won for Russia, and it gives them access to the Baltic Sea and access to trade with the rest of Western Europe. Okay, picture of St. Petersburg today. Another picture of St. Petersburg. This is the summer castle, I believe, that he had built for himself in St. Petersburg. Okay, kind of reminds you of the Palace of Versailles, doesn't it? Okay, another part of this westernization for Russia was Peter forcing wealthy Russians to study science in foreign countries. He made his scientists, his shipbuilders, his astronomers, his military officers go and study in Western Europe and bring that information back to Russia. And as a result, he succeeded at making Russia one of the most powerful countries in Europe. So instead of being behind, right, as a country, which is what Peter inherited as Tsar, he increased Russia's power and made them one of the most powerful in Europe. All right, and finally, our last Russian monarch, Catherine the Great. She is known as an enlightened despot. The one topic that we have left is the European Enlightenment, and that was all about challenging government. Okay, and the idea that government should be used to help its people, not oppress its people. And so, as the Tsarina of Russia, she wanted to do that. Okay, she ruled Russia from 1762 until 1796. She was married to the Russian heir to the throne, who was mentally unstable. She actually made great friends with his military advisors and some of his political advisors, and organized a coup d'etat, essentially a quick overthrow of her own husband's power, and then named herself the new ruler of Russia. Okay, so by enlightened despot, a despot is an absolute ruler, but she was enlightened. In other words, she wants to use her power to make Russia better. So she formed a committee to review Russia's laws and to change them so that they were more fair to the people. She wanted to allow religious freedom, abolish torture and the death penalty in Russia. Although she wanted those changes, they never actually happened because during her reign there was a huge revolt of the serfs who still existed. That if you remember the feudalism triangle, right, and the serfs are at the bottom. Russia still had serfs from that feudal period, and there was a huge uprising of serfs during her reign, and that led her to mistrust the serfs and the peasants in Russia and not want to then give them the rights that she originally hoped for. Okay, so she ended up giving the nobles absolute power over their serfs. She is still considered Catherine the Great because she expanded the territory that Russia controlled. She gained more land for Russia along the Black Sea, which again is going to increase their trade routes and their ability to trade long distance. And she expanded it westward into what is current day Poland. Okay, so the map here shows this. Let's see. The light blue territory shows us the land gained by Peter the Great, right? This is another good example of St. Petersburg as the window to the west on that Baltic Sea, okay? But the dark purple shows the land added by 1796, which was added during Catherine's reign, land that she gained for Russia, and you can see it extends into Eastern Europe, into what would today be Poland, and here along the Black Sea, like I said, good for trade routes. Okay, that is the end of the absolute rulers in Russia. Now we're going to move over to England, and England has a special case. England is going to be our only country without absolute monarchy. Okay, and that goes back to something we kind of skipped over. If we had been in class, I would have spent a little bit of time on this. But it is a document in English history known as the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter, which the people forced their king to sign back in 1215. Okay, towards the end of the Middle Ages, King John signed the Magna Carta, and basically this established a limited monarchy for the rest of English history, which means that the king and queen hold some power in England, but they also have a representative legislative body, like we have Congress here in the United States, and that representative body in England is called Parliament. And the people of England send their representatives to Parliament to have a voice in the government, along with the power of the king and the queen. Okay, so the first limited monarch from England that you have to know is Charles I, and he really did not appreciate that, looking around the rest of Europe, everyone else, all the other monarchs of other countries had that absolute power, but he did not. And he tried to expand his power and to gain more power at the expense of the English people and Parliament, and were not having it. So in 1628, he was forced to sign the Petition of Right, which he had to acknowledge the limitations on his power. In this document, he agreed that he would not imprison subjects without due cause. He would not levy taxes without Parliament's consent. He would not house soldiers in private homes of the people, and he would not impose martial law in peacetime. A lot of these should sound familiar from laws that we have here in the United States, right? Like the writ of habeas corpus. You can't be held in jail unless you're going to be charged with a crime. And if they're not going to charge you with a crime, they have to let you go, right? Look at that first bullet. He agreed that he would not imprison subjects without due cause. Okay. No taxation without representation, right? He agreed that he would not levy taxes without Parliament's consent. So Charles was forced to sign this petition, and he did so because he was forced, but he really did not intend to follow or make good on the promises that he made in signing the Petition of Right. Okay, here's Charles the First. And so a large group came to oppose Charles I. They were called the Puritans, and these are the same Puritans who left England in the early 1600s and came to Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay Colony for their religious freedom. Okay, and Charles is going to end up having to fight to maintain his power over the Puritans in what is known as the English Civil War. The Puritans were led by a guy named Oliver Cromwell, and at one point in 1647, they were able to capture the king and held him prisoner. He was put on trial before the English people. He was given a public trial, and he was found guilty, and he became the first reigning monarch to be faced with a public trial and publicly executed. Okay, so the people and Parliament in England will really show anyone who would, come to be a monarch after this that they cannot attempt to gain absolute power. Okay, just to kind of finish out that English Civil War here, Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the Puritans, ended up becoming the temporary ruler of England, and he ruled more like a dictator. So it's ironic that they were trying to overthrow a king who was trying to exercise too much power, and now Oliver Cromwell does the same. Okay, so he ruled until his death until 1658. When he died, the members of Parliament realized that they could not continue to have total dictators in charge, and so they chose a new king. It was actually Charles I's oldest son, Charles II. And under Charles II's rule, more rights were extended to the people, like I mentioned, that writ of habeas corpus. And when Charles II's brother died, when Charles II died, his heir to the throne was his brother, James II. The problem with James II is that he was a Catholic. And as you know, going back to Henry VIII, England was a Protestant country under the Church of England. And so Parliament did not want a Catholic king ruling over them and the English people. So they found a solution to this problem through James II's daughter, Mary, who actually was not living in England at the time. She was Protestant, and she had moved to the Netherlands when she married the Prince of the Netherlands, William. And so Parliament went to William and Mary and asked if they would be willing to come back to England and rule as co-monarchs under Protestantism in England. And so they agreed. And this shift in power, this change of power from James II, who was a Catholic, to his daughter Mary and her husband William, is known as the Glorious Revolution, because they came in. They did bring their army. James and his army did not try to fight back. In fact, James fled with his army to France. And now the Parliament and the English people are happy with their new rulers, William and Mary, under Protestantism. Okay, William and Mary agreed to recognize Parliament as their partner in governing, and they didn't do it because they were forced to recognize Parliament or forced to recognize their limited authority. They did it because they believed in this limited monarchy. England became a constitutional monarchy, which means they wrote up their constitution. And part of that constitution was that the king or queen, or both in this case, were not above the law. Okay. And so under William and Mary, the English Bill of Rights were written. And if you notice, a lot of these are similar to the Bill of Rights that we have here in America. The king and queen under the English Bill of Rights could not suspend Parliament's laws. So they, if Parliament passed a law, they had to abide by it. The king and queen could not levy taxes without permission from Parliament. Again, that no taxation without representation. No interfering with freedom of speech in Parliament. So if someone wanted to criticize them or their policies or their rule in Parliament, they could not be stopped from doing so. And there were no punishments for a citizen who petitions the king, or in this case, king and queen, with their complaints. So they were, the people and Parliament were allowed to publicly criticize their government, which obviously is something that we also have here in the United States. So that is the end. I didn't do too bad, I hope. So I am going to post a Google form with some questions on these slides for you to answer. After that, we have one more assignment on the Enlightenment. I'm going to do another screencast because this is the last opportunity that I really have to talk to you guys, if you're even listening and watching these anymore. But the Enlightenment especially is one of those topics that is going to come up pretty early next year when you get into Global 10. You really have to know the philosophers of the Enlightenment and their ideas and how they brought about change in Europe. So that'll be our last assignment. And then I'm going to ask you guys to please fill out a survey for me, which will be due on Wednesday next week, which is the last day of school, just for some of your feedback about what you liked and didn't like and things that I could change for next year, whatever format that is going to be. So thanks for listening, guys. Have a good day. And I'm sorry that this was posted a little bit late.